You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Elections Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. It's January 1911 in Albany, New York. New York State Assemblyman Al Smith strolls down the sidewalk and flashes his famous grin at the many passers-by. Al's features are hard to miss. He has a winning smile, a famously large nose, and a big personality to match it. As he rounds the corner onto a busy street, Al sees a familiar face.
Well, look who it is. How do you do, Al? How do you do, Robert?
Al Smith and Robert Wagner are longtime friends, former roommates, and fellow Democrats. Al's the head of the New York State Assembly's powerful Ways and Means Committee. Robert's the president of the New York State Senate. The Tammany Twins, as they're sometimes called, are deeply connected to Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party machine in New York. Al can tell from the look on his good friend Robert's face, though, that all is not well.
What's the matter, Robert? I'm on my way to call on a certain junior senator from New York who's been causing problems ever since he arrived in Albany.
Al knows exactly who Robert is talking about. He's never met the man personally, but the freshman senator's reputation precedes him. He's developed an annoying reputation for having scruples.
What's he done now? He won't budge on Blue-Eyed Billy, Al. He's dug in his heels.
Blue-Eyed Billy Sheehan is the former lieutenant governor of New York and Tammany Hall's choice to run for the U.S. Senate in the upcoming election. But this annoying freshman senator is standing in Blue-Eyed Billy's way.
Robert, you're one of the most powerful men in the state. Tell him to fall in line. Yeah, he has a legion of supporters standing behind him, Al. Enough to block Sheehan's path to the Senate. I'm on my way now to his house to try and strike a deal.
And since when do you make deals with freshman senators?
It's humiliating. But I don't think I have a choice.
Al thinks for a moment. Then he offers up his services.
I believe I'd like to join you, Robert. Itching for a fight, are we? Always.
Not long after, Robert and Al arrive at the front steps of a nearby palatial townhouse on the corner of South Swan and State Street. As they make their way up the front steps, Al takes in the opulent facade of the building.
How does a state senator afford a place like this? Well, his last name, you know.
After a few moments, the door creaks open. But it's not the freshman senator standing on the other side. It's a butler in formal attire.
May I help you, gentlemen?
Before Robert has a chance to answer, Al cuts him off.
Senator Wagner and Assemblyman Smith to see Senator Roosevelt, please.
The butler's face falls into a confused expression.
I know Mr. Roosevelt is expecting Senator Wagner, but, sir...
Perplexed, the butler trails off. Al flashes his famous smile.
Oh, that's all right.
Al brushes right past the butler and barges inside.
I'll just come along, too.
Throughout his career, Al Smith loved to tell the story of the night he met Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Though Al never divulged what transpired in their meeting, the facts point to a Roosevelt victory. In January of 1911, FDR, as he would come to be known, began his first term as a New York State Senator. He'd been elected on a promise to go to bat for the American worker and fight against Tammany Hall, the notoriously corrupt Democratic Party machine in New York. In FDR's mind, Blue-Eyed Billy Sheehan was the embodiment of that corruption, and thanks to FDR's resistance, Tammany Hall eventually dropped Sheehan and went in a different direction. But Al Smith did not appreciate FDR's crusade. He once said of him, "Franklin just isn't the sort of man you can take into the piss room and talk intimately with." But though they began as enemies, Al and FDR would eventually form an alliance. Al would learn to accept FDR's scruples. FDR would learn to accept Al's penchant for power. Together, the two New Yorkers would redefine New York politics, change the face of the Democratic Party, and define the 1932 election. Wicked Game is sponsored by NetSuite. There's that saying, That's just the cost of doing business, and it makes it sound like there's nothing you can do about certain expenses. And yeah, sure, if you run a business, there are certain things that are just going to cost what they cost, and recently they've probably begun costing more. But not everything is just the cost of doing business. Smart companies know their numbers and can reduce their costs. One great way of doing both is switching to NetSuite, the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one platform and one source of truth. And with NetSuite, you'll reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud with no hardware required, accessible from anywhere. You'll cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems because you've got one unified business management suite, and you improve efficiency by bringing all your major business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move, so do the math and see how you'll profit with NetSuite this year. By popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. Head to netsuite.com/elections. That's netsuite.com/elections, netsuite.com/elections. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Elections Wicked Game. Al Smith, the son of Irish immigrants, had truly come from nothing. Babe Ruth, the famous baseball player, admired Al's humble beginnings and wished him well. I wasn't fed with a gold spoon when I was a kid. No poor boy can go any too high in this world to suit me. On the strength of his personality and hard work, Al became a powerful New York State assemblyman, an effective New York County sheriff, a beloved 4-term New York governor, and finally, the 1928 Democratic nominee for president. After he lost that contest to Herbert Hoover, Al took a lucrative job as president of the Empire State Building, but he never gave up on his dream of winning the White House. FDR, on the other hand, had been born into privilege and prestige. Both his parents had come from wealthy New York families. After receiving a world-class education at Harvard and Columbia Law School, FDR had entered a career in politics. He served in the New York State Senate and went on to become Woodrow Wilson's Assistant Secretary of the Navy and eventually Governor of New York right after Al Smith. But the two governors, Al and FDR, were not politically aligned on every issue. Though Al was a champion of labor, he was slightly more conservative, and he was a Tammany Hall man. FDR was a progressive in the tradition of Woodrow Wilson. He was frequently a thorn in Tammany Hall's side. But over the years, the two men formed a deep bond and a lasting friendship. Perhaps because both men were ambitious, both men cared about the plight of the little guy, and both men knew what it meant to struggle. Al had risen to power in New York even in the face of widespread anti-Catholic sentiment. He was a relentless politician who loved the limelight. His genuine affection for politics earned him the nickname the Happy Warrior. FDR was a warrior too. He had fought through multiple illnesses. He contracted the Spanish flu and lived to tell the tale, only to be diagnosed with a severe muscular disease. Though at the time doctors believed it was polio, FDR's symptoms were more consistent with Guillain-Barré syndrome. FDR didn't lose his entire ability to walk, but he was extremely difficult and painful, and so FDR chose to use a wheelchair. After this polio diagnosis and retiring to a chair, many believed FDR's political career was over, but not Al Smith. After Al won the Democratic presidential nomination in 1928, he announced his intention not to stand for re-election as governor of New York. Instead, Al handpicked FDR to be his successor. Al's endorsement and his ferocious campaigning on FDR's behalf helped his friend win the governorship. But as the 1932 presidential election drew near, the very ambition that first brought Al Smith and FDR together would threaten to render their friendship apart. Both men wanted the White House. To secure their party's nomination, the two titans of New York politics would sever their bonds of friendship and go to war at the Democratic National Convention. This is episode 37, 1932, Hoover versus Roosevelt versus Smith, two governors. On May 1st, 1931, the Empire State Building officially opened for business. The 102-story architectural marvel was a leftover symbol of the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties. Its very existence belied the harsh realities of the Great Depression, arguably the most devastating financial crisis in U.S. history. The stock market crash of 1929 and the ensuing depression crippled the American economy on almost every level. And even as the Empire State Building opened in May of 1931, the tragedy of the Depression was on full display in New York. Bread lines were long, jobs were gone. Droves of homeless Americans lived in Central Park in shacks and tents. The Depression had not stopped construction of the Empire State Building, but it had severely reduced the need for office space. Well over half of the offices sat empty. But former New York Governor Al Smith, the president of the Empire State Building, was a master of public relations. So on May 1st, 1931, Al staged a PR stunt. He invited his longtime friend, current Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As the two men stood on the observation deck of the 86th floor looking out over the city, reporters fired off questions and photographers snapped away. On the surface, it seemed to be a happy affair. Al joyfully pointed out landmarks to FDR, who walked with the help of leg braces. As the two men sturdied themselves against the powerful gusting wind, FDR told the press, "All I'm going to ask him to do is reserve for me an office in this building so that when I leave Albany, I will have someplace to go." Al replied, "About that office, the next day you're in town, I will have you down in the rental department." But underneath the smiles, tension was brewing. When a reporter started to ask a question by saying governor, Al Smith chimed in, "Which one?" Governor Roosevelt was Al Smith's chosen heir. Al had fully expected FDR to carry forward the torch of the legacy he had built over 4 terms in the governor's office. During Al's tenure in Albany, he had accomplished a great deal, pushed for social welfare programs, civil service reforms, and the creation of public parks. And FDR had campaigned on a promise to finish what Al had started. He had promised to modernize the government, to expand its role as a bulwark to the private sector, and to beef up regulations. But FDR's first term had started in January of 1929. In just a few months, the stock market crash had brought FDR's plans to a screeching halt. As Governor Roosevelt worked to help New York survive the Depression, he and Al became increasingly estranged. The first big fight had been over alcohol. Throughout 1931, Democratic Party leaders across the country already had an eye on the upcoming 1932 election. One big question was whether or not the party platform should include the repeal of the 18th Amendment, the constitutional prohibition of alcohol. Al and FDR had found themselves on opposite sides of the argument. Al was a wet politician, meaning he was in favor of repealing the 18th Amendment. FDR was not a dry politician. He was not a staunch supporter of the 18th Amendment at all. But he was worried that pushing for repeal was politically risky. In FDR's mind, talking about booze in the middle of a depression might alienate the Democrats' base in the South, where prohibition still enjoyed strong support. Not to mention, President Hoover and the Republicans were politically vulnerable as a result of the Depression. Better to keep the conversation focused on the failure of Republican economic policy rather than to bring booze to the forefront and hand Hoover a winning talking point. Al saw it a different way. He believed the Republicans were vulnerable on prohibition as well. In Al's mind, men like President Hoover were trying to have it both ways with booze. Republicans were wet in the North and they were dry in the South. This, in Al's mind, was hypocrisy, and the Democrats needed to attack it. Additionally, Al could sense that the American people were growing tired of prohibition and tired of the Depression. Making booze legal again and taxing it might be a winning strategy. In early 1931, Al had worked through back channels to help push for an anti-prohibition plank to be included in the 1932 Democratic platform. FDR had worked through back channels to quietly kill it. Their fight had been about the politics of booze, but it had also been about something else. Who would occupy the White House? Both men wanted to be president. In the summer of 1930, FDR had told a friend, I believe I can be nominated for the presidency in 1932 on the Democratic ticket. Al Smith had already received his party's nomination in 1928, and on the campaign trail he had suffered brutal attacks. Al was Irish Catholic, the son of immigrants. Throughout his career, this made him the frequent target of the KKK and many in the Southern press. And though Al had lost to Herbert Hoover in 1928, by 1931, he was ready to make another run. Though neither man had publicly declared their intentions, their scuffle over booze had drawn a figurative line in the sand right down the middle of New York politics. On one side stood FDR, on the other, Al Smith. In the end, FDR had won the first battle over booze, but Al Smith would try to win the next battle over an entirely different issue: trees. During his first term, Governor Roosevelt had approved nearly $20 million for reforestation in New York. New Yorkers had to approve FDR's plan, but it looked poised to pass. The plan was beloved by many, and it enjoyed broad, bipartisan support. During his 4 terms as governor, Al Smith had never taken a position on replanting trees one way or the other. But in the fall of 1931, with the Democratic National Convention 9 months away, he suddenly took an interest. In a radio address from Carnegie Hall, Al went on the attack. If FDR wanted to replant trees, Al charged, he shouldn't put it before the people for a vote. He should follow the state constitution and put it on the floor of the New York State Legislature. Al's public attack against FDR got people's attention. A few days later, the Democratic mayor of Chicago told the New York Times that the Democrats' next presidential nominee should be a man of the Al Smith type. In early November 1931, the Times reported that Al's tirade against the reforestation plan had been resented by Governor Roosevelt's friends, who believed that it has shown definitely that Mr. Smith intends to do everything he can to prevent Governor Roosevelt from obtaining the presidential nomination. In the end, Al's efforts to kill the reforestation plan fell flat. New Yorkers voted for FDR's plan, but he didn't take a victory lap, though. FDR extended an olive branch. On November 18, 1931, FDR invited Al Smith to his townhouse in Manhattan. On his way inside, Al told reporters, "I'm here to eat." Their lunch lasted 2 hours, and afterwards both men told the press that they had discussed matters of state. After the meeting, Al told a mutual friend, "By God, he did not mention to me the subject of his candidacy." But apparently, Al didn't mention the subject of his either, and FDR was starting to get worried that Al might run against him. Ed Flynn, New York Secretary of State, was a decided FDR man, but he was also Irish Catholic, and Al was his good friend. So when FDR asked Ed to pay Al a visit and get some answers, Ed Flynn was happy to oblige. In Al's office at the Empire State Building, Ed asked him the million-dollar question: "Are you going to run?" In response, Al spread a stack of financial documents across his desk and said, "Ed, these are all the debts I must clear up. Financially, I am in an extremely bad position." It was definitely not a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Al, the master of PR, knew that being cagey would fuel speculation in the Roosevelt camp and in the press. Not long after, a false story began to circulate in the papers that FDR had called Al a rotten governor. In January of 1932, FDR told the New York Times, "Any man who circulates a story of that kind is not only a liar, but is a contemptible liar." That same month, FDR sent a letter to the Democratic State Committee in North Dakota, accepting their endorsement for the presidential nomination. But FDR was worried that Al believed the rumor in the papers, so he invited Al to meet with him in Albany. As a matter of protocol, he announced the invitation in the press. Al's office released a statement politely declining. Then on February 7th, Al summoned reporters to his office at the Empire State Building. He said, "Well, here it is, boys," and he handed out copies of a brief statement. It read, "If the Democratic National Convention should decide it wants me to lead, I will make the fight." So the two governors were officially in the race. FDR was perhaps the frontrunner, but to win the Democratic nomination, he would have to get the best of the happy warrior. And in February of 1932, Al Smith set out to do what he did best: played the press like a fiddle. It's February 8, 1932 in New York City, at the newly erected Empire State Building. Former New York Governor Al Smith rides the elevator up to his office. He's dressed in funeral attire, a black suit and a black top hat. Earlier today, Al attended the funeral of Tammany Hall figurehead John Voorhees. There, he ran into Governor Roosevelt. The two men exchanged a few private words. Even though he's dressed for a funeral, Al is still all smiles. A cigar hangs from his smirking lips, because Al knows his run-in with Roosevelt at the funeral is already the talk of the town.
Mr. Smith, follow me, boys.
Al leads a large crowd of reporters to his office. Once inside, he removes his top hat. He lights his cigar and he flashes the reporters his famous smile.
All right. Now, who has questions for me? Mr. Smith, one at a time, boys. You'll all get your chance. You,
Mr. Smith, have you received any telegrams offering your congratulations?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I have.
Would you be willing to share?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I would.
Al reaches for a stack of telegrams on his desk.
This one here is from a fellow from Scranton, Pennsylvania by the name of John Durkin. It says, "Attaboy, Al."
All smiles, Al takes the large stack in his hands and shows it to the reporters.
And there's plenty more where that came from. Is there one from Governor Roosevelt?
For just a moment, the smile falls from Al's face. Then he replies with a twinkle in his eye.
Wow, there's so many in here. I haven't read them all yet. What did Mr. Roosevelt say to you at the funeral? He asked me to come up to the house. Did you? I did.
Right after the funeral, Al did accompany Roosevelt to his home on East 65th Street. The men talked for nearly an hour.
And what did you discuss?
Al is enjoying this. He loves being the center of attention and toying with the press.
Well, it was all social. Come on, Al, do you expect us to believe politics didn't come up at all? If you won't take my word for it, ask Mr. Roosevelt. Was there anything that happened or anything that might happen that would cause you to withdraw your name from the race? I can only speak for today.
A reporter for the New York Times took Al up on his suggestion. After the Q&A in Al's office, the reporter contacted Roosevelt's office and asked for the governor's version of their meeting. When the reporter told a staffer that Al Smith had called the meeting social, Roosevelt's staffer replied, "Then it was social. Whatever Smith says on the subject goes." Al Smith's soiree with a gaggle of reporters was big news. And in the lead up to the Democratic National Convention, Al would do his damnedest to stay in the spotlight. Behind closed doors, he would do everything in his power to deny FDR the nomination and keep the top spot for himself. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Elections Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. For Democrats across the country, the choice between Al Smith and FDR was not a simple one, and it was a choice the party desperately needed to get right. In the 70 years since the Civil War, Democrats had produced only two successful candidates, Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson. Republican prosperity had trumped the Democratic agenda time and time again. But in the election of 1932, Republican prosperity was over, and President Herbert Hoover was vulnerable. The American banking system had collapsed. Businesses were failing, wages were down, and jobs non-existent as unemployment skyrocketed to 25%. To a large extent, Americans blamed Herbert Hoover. The shanty towns cropping up across the country from New York to California were nicknamed Hoovervilles. But the anti-Hoover sentiment didn't stop the Republicans from standing by their man. At the Republican National Convention in June of 1932, the party renominated Herbert Hoover and his vice president Charles Curtis. Republican leaders did their best to quiet dissent and focused on Hoover's core message, solving the economic crisis by balancing budgets. Prior to the Depression, Hoover had been a popular president, and he had beaten Al Smith in the 1928 contest by a landslide. Hoover had fared well in the South, in large part because Al represented many things the Southern people largely didn't like. He was Irish, he was Catholic, he was anti-prohibition. In 1932, many Democrats, especially FDR supporters, were worried about history repeating itself. So in the run-up to the Democratic Convention, FDR supporters were working behind the scenes to make sure Al Smith's nomination was dead on arrival. But to get the best of Al, FDR had to win New York. And there, FDR had a serious problem. New York City Mayor Jimmy Walker. Going into the convention, FDR was in a tight spot. For many Democratic reformers, FDR had turned into a shell of his former self. He had once been a champion of the little guy, unafraid to stand up to the corruption of Tammany Hall. But by 1932, FDR had changed. He was aware of certain political realities. If he fought too hard against Tammany Hall, he risked losing New York and handing the nomination to Al Smith. Corruption in the Empire State was a tale as old as time. And if New York City was the epicenter of that corruption, New York City Mayor Jimmy Walker was the dirtiest of the bunch. Prior to the convention, Governor Roosevelt had been reluctant to go after Mayor Walker, fearful of angering Tammany Hall. But under pressure from reformers, FDR had eventually buckled and opened an investigation into New York City corruption. For many Tammany Hall politicians, FDR had gone too far, and for many reformers, he had not gone far enough. In February 1932, New York prosecutor Samuel Seabury told the New York Times, "Tammany's power drives public men whose instincts would lead them to speak out and protest against corruption that has been revealed to a sullen silence. They know the conditions are evil, but they fear to antagonize the power of Tammany Hall." Any contemporary reader would have known to whom Seabury was referring. FDR certainly knew. But to FDR, Seabury's statement wasn't just a thesis against corruption. It looked to Roosevelt as if Seabury was trying to make a play for the 1932 Democratic nomination. In June of 1932, Seabury sent Governor Roosevelt a letter laying out the case for removing Mayor Walker on grounds of corruption. The timing was suspicious. The Democratic National Convention was set to take place in Chicago in a matter of weeks, and not long after Seabury sent the letter, Democratic delegates began receiving what was, in effect, campaign literature about Seabury, the great champion of reform. Seabury's letter backed FDR into a corner. Would he go after Walker and risk alienating Tammany Hall? Or would he give Walker a pass and inflame the reformers? FDR struggled with the decision. He told the press, "Never has a governor been asked to remove an elective officer on such evidence." And so FDR chose a third option. He put the ball in Walker's court. Just before the convention, FDR sent Mayor Walker Seabury's letter and told the mayor he awaited his reply. While FDR awaited Mayor Walker's next move, behind the scenes at the convention, Al Smith was making moves of his own. Going into Chicago, FDR had a large block of delegates pledged to his side, more than Al and the rest of the potential nominees combined. But Al was determined to win, or at the very least, to prevent FDR from winning. To steal the nomination from Roosevelt, Al needed to win the state of California. The California delegation was largely under the control of William Gibbs McAdoo, a prominent California lawyer. To win California, Al needed McAdoo in his corner, but McAdoo despised Al. In the 1924 election, McAdoo had wanted the Democratic nomination himself, but Al had blocked his path. So Al had to try and make nice. A few days before the first gavel of the convention, Al and McAdoo met in private. In the closed-door meeting, Al failed to secure McAdoo's support, but he had extended a peace offering, and he had done his best to ensure that California would not support Governor Roosevelt. Al Smith's biggest boost, though, had come from prosecutor Samuel Seabury. Many delegates worried that Seabury's letter would make Governor Roosevelt vulnerable in the general election. In order to beat President Hoover, Democrats needed to win New York. Mayor Walker was extremely popular all across the state. But then again, the evidence against him was so significant that Governor Roosevelt could not ignore it forever. He would have to do something, And when he did, delegates worried that Democrats in New York would stay home on Election Day and hand the contest to Hoover. The Democratic National Convention began in late June 1932. Balloting started on June 30th and lasted late into the night. When the New York delegation was called, they began a voice vote. Mayor and delegate Jimmy Walker's name was called, but there was no answer. Jimmy Walker was MIA. Many wondered if Walker had fled the country to escape prosecution. But in the wee hours of the morning, Jimmy Walker would make his presence known. It's before dawn on July 1st, 1932. The weary and exhausted Democratic delegates are packed inside Chicago Stadium. Balloting state by state is a long, arduous process, one that's lasted all through the night. New York's delegates have just finished a dreadfully boring voice vote. Most of the delegates in the stadium are doing everything they can not to nod off. Convention Chairman Thomas J. Walsh stands at the podium on stage. Just as he opens his mouth to deliver the result of New York's ballot, a lone voice calls out from the hall.
Mr. Chairman!
The stadium stirs slightly as the delegates are awakened from their boredom. Walsh squints at the man standing at the microphone in the crowd, but he's too far away to be seen.
Who is the gentleman who addresses the chair? Walker, a delegate from New York.
The stadium erupts and gasps and murmurs. At the convention, Walker hadn't been seen. He even missed his chance to vote. But Walker's the kind of man who likes to make an entrance, and when the roll call was underway, he slipped in unnoticed to spring this surprise.
For what purpose does he address the chair? The delegate was not here when his name was called. His alternate voted in his stead. The delegate is now here and requests permission to cast his own vote. The request is granted.
Walker's fate is in the hands of Governor Roosevelt. FDR has been breathing down Walker's neck about the charges of corruption leveled against him. So Walker has a choice: peace with FDR or war. Walker leans in close to the mic and speaks clearly and decisively.
This delegate casts his vote for Alfred E. Smith.
Mayor Jimmy Walker's dramatic appearance brought the tired delegates back to life. As the New York Times reported, the thunder of applause that followed was spontaneous, genuine, and hearty. Delegates shouted at each other, danced, cheered, declaring in less than refined terms that Walker had intestinal fortitude. All were aware that the mayor's fate was resting in the hands of Governor Roosevelt. With his vote, Walker had publicly flouted the investigation and dared FDR to come after him, putting Governor Roosevelt's back against the wall and creating an opening for Al to exploit. The first day of balloting at the Democratic National Convention officially ended around 7 a.m. on July 1st, 1932. After the delegates' votes were counted, FDR was clearly in the lead, but he was short of the two-thirds majority required to win. Al Smith was in a distant second place, but thanks in part to Mayor Walker, Al had New York in his corner. FDR supporters assumed that after the first ballot, the delegates behind the minor candidates would switch their votes to the frontrunner. But they didn't, leaving the FDR camp deeply concerned, and Al Smith feeling confident that he had FDR right where he wanted him. From a strategic standpoint, Al believed that if California got behind him, the rest of the up-for-grab states would follow suit. Through back-channel intermediaries, he sent an offer to William Gibbs McAdoo. If California pledged her votes to Al, McAdoo and his friends would be mightily rewarded. But McAdoo did not trust Al. He had been burned by him one too many times. McAdoo did trust the Speaker of the House, John Garner of Texas, and Al Smith believed that if Garner told McAdoo to fall in line, McAdoo would do it in the name of party unity. Additionally, Garner would bring Texas's delegates with him. So Al sought to give Garner something he desperately wanted: more power. To broker a deal, Al leaned on one of his closest political advisors, someone the New York Times once called the most powerful woman in politics, Belle Moskowitz. At Al's behest, Moskowitz picked up the phone, dialed Garner's hotel in Chicago, and asked to speak to the Texas representative. After placing her on a brief hold, the hotel employee told Moskowitz, "You may tell Governor Smith that Speaker Garner is here. The reason you can't get him is that he refuses to answer the phone." But FDR was having better luck. While Al set his sights on William Gibbs McAdoo, FDR was focused on another California power broker, William Randolph Hearst, the powerful media mogul from San Francisco. Like McAdoo, Hearst had been burned by Al Smith before, too. In the 1920s, Hearst had made a run for U.S. Senate in New York. Al had torpedoed his chances. In retaliation, Hearst and his many newspapers had shunned Al in the 1928 election and supported Herbert Hoover instead. FDR supporters sought to use Hearst's animus and his influence to FDR's advantage. But Hearst was not an FDR fan. In his mind, FDR was too progressive, too much of an internationalist in the tradition of Woodrow Wilson. But Hearst was a supporter of Speaker of the House John Garner. And in the end, his hatred for Al Smith would prove greater than his reservations of FDR. Hearst met in private with one of FDR's surrogates to entertain an offer. If the California delegation backed FDR, Garner would be named vice president. And so, the outcome of the 1932 Democratic Convention would be decided by one of Al Smith's greatest political enemies. In the home stretch of the convention, William Randolph Hearst would have his revenge on the Happy Warrior. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the Revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. It's July 2nd, 1932, at a hotel room in Chicago, Illinois. At the nearby Chicago Stadium, the Democratic delegates are desperate to break the gridlock and choose a nominee. Former New York Governor Al Smith hasn't left this room, his Chicago headquarters, all day. Just this morning, the room was bustling with well-wishers and adoring fans. Now it's all but empty, save for a handful of loyal staffers. Al is pacing, chomping on his cigar.
Haul that radio in here.
Yes, sir. About an hour ago, Al's campaign received word that Speaker of the House John Garner switched his vote to Governor Roosevelt. Word at the convention is Roosevelt is flying into Chicago from New York to receive his party's nomination in person. No presidential nominee in history has ever been so bold. Garner's switch, orchestrated by William Randolph Hearst, is a crushing blow, but it is not defeat, not yet. There's still a shred of hope. Al has lost Texas, but if California remains loyal, he might be able to block FDR's path to victory.
Turn it up, will you?
Al's staffer turns up the volume on the radio as former Treasury Secretary William Gibbs McAdoo, the head of the California delegation, takes the podium.
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for the privilege you've accorded to me to say just a word in explaining the vote of the state of California. I'll make it loud enough. Don't worry about that. California came here to nominate a president of the United States. She did not come here to deadlock this convention. When any man comes into this convention with 700 votes in his favor, I take it as indicative of the public sentiment of the country for that candidate. He's entitled to the nomination.
It's over, and Al knows it. He shakes his head in disgust.
All right, pack it up, everyone. We're going home.
One of Al's staffers nervously approaches the former governor. He's about to bring up a topic he knows Al won't like, conceding. Now, if you throw your support behind Governor Roosevelt, the nomination would be unanimous. So, in the interest of party unity, but Al folds his arms defiantly. I won't do it. I won't do it. I won't do it. The staffers get the message. They get to work packing up the campaign literature, banners, and important papers. Just as they finish boxing up the office, the official word comes down over the radio.
Total votes cast, 1,148 and 1/2. Necessary to a choice, 766. Franklin D. Roosevelt, having received more than 2/3 of all the delegates voting, I proclaim him the nominee of this convention for President of the United States.
At about that time, Al's daughter enters the room. Immediately, she can tell her father is inconsolable, so she quietly escorts him out of the Barron headquarters, down the hall, and toward the elevator. As they step inside, she asks, "What now, Father?" "Going right to bed." William Randolph Hearst came through for FDR. He brokered the deal and delivered the California delegation, with enough delegates for FDR to secure the required 2/3 majority. In exchange, Speaker John Garner was named FDR's vice presidential running mate. Not long after McAdoo's speech, Al left Chicago and returned to New York to lick his wounds. Once back home, he told the press, "I am tired and just want to get a rest." The rumors Al Smith heard that day in Chicago were true. Roosevelt did fly from New York to Chicago to accept the nomination in person, the first nominee in history to ever do so. In the stadium, Roosevelt made his case.
I have started out on the tasks that lie ahead by breaking the absurd tradition that the candidate should remain in professed ignorance of what has happened for weeks until he is formally notified of that event many weeks later. You have nominated me, and I know it, and I am here to thank you for the honor. Let it also be symbolic that in so doing, I broke traditions. Let it be from now on the task of our party to break foolish traditions. I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. Give me your help not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
After Roosevelt's speech, the band played FDR's campaign song, "Happy Days Are Here Again." Al Smith was most assuredly not happy with the outcome of the convention, but President Herbert Hoover was. Hoover believed that the Democrats had made a fatal mistake by nominating FDR. In Hoover's mind, FDR was far too progressive for the average American. If Hoover could turn the economy around before November, he believed he stood a fighting chance. Though his official headquarters were in Chicago, Hoover conducted his campaign from the White House, often making radio addresses and holding press events in the Rose Garden. But in the summer of 1932, Hoover's campaign plans were interrupted by a political invasion. In June, a group of over 40,000 unemployed World War I veterans had marched on Washington. The Bonus Army, as they were called, demanded the early release of bonus pay they were promised for their service to the country. Congress had passed a bonus bill a year earlier, authorizing the early release of the bonus funds, but Hoover had vetoed it. At their camp near downtown Washington, Bonus Army protesters were demanding their money. Their slogan was, "In Hoover we trusted, now we're busted." Worried about communist influence, Hoover ordered the Secret Service to infiltrate the ranks of the Bonus Army. The agents found that while some communists had joined the protesters, they were not a substantial threat. But the Secret Service did recommend Hoover minimize his public appearances, always bad news for a president in a campaign year. Hoover had largely avoided conflict with the Bonus Army protesters until July 28, 1932, when a fight broke out between the veterans and local police. Shots were fired. One protester was killed. The Army was deployed to support the Washington police, and with tear gas pluming downtown, the Bonus Army camp suddenly went up in flames. Government officials claimed the protesters started the fire. Many in the press blamed the government troops. Hoover and many in his administration blamed the communist infiltrators. The skirmish made front-page news all across the country. The public was outraged. One reporter who had been injured in the scuffle wrote that he had nothing but bitter feelings towards Herbert Hoover. But like Hoover, FDR had also opposed the early release of the bonus Army funds. It was an astronomical sum of money, equal to the federal budget for an entire year. But FDR, like most Americans, could not understand why Hoover had deployed the military against military veterans. FDR had always held Hoover in high esteem, but after the bonus Army debacle, FDR recanted, saying there was nothing left inside the man but jelly. Maybe there never had been anything. The bonus Army incident all but tanked Herbert Hoover's re-election prospects, but it also gave FDR political cover to deal with a problem that he had been neglecting, Mayor Jimmy Walker. President Hoover was now vulnerable, but in order to ensure victory, FDR needed to win New York, and going to war with New York City's popular Irish Catholic mayor, a man who was well entrenched in Tammany Hall, was a risky move. If New York's Irish population sat out the election, Hoover could win New York. Still, the evidence of corruption against Walker was too damning to ignore. So in August of 1932, FDR summoned Walker to Albany and confronted him. The meeting in FDR's office was contentious, and Walker left in a huff. On September 1, 1932, one of FDR's supporters begged the nominee not to confront Walker. When FDR refused to back down, his supporter angrily asked, "So you'd rather be right than president?" But in the end, FDR wouldn't have to make a decision. In just a few days, Walker resigned. It wasn't out of the blue, though. There was a man behind his decision, Al Smith. In late August, Al had put the screws to Walker in a private meeting at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. Al had told him, "Jim, you're through." By convincing Walker to resign, Al was tacitly helping FDR win the general election. And in the end, for the happy warrior, party loyalty trumped any ill will he felt for Roosevelt. Al Smith and FDR officially buried the hatchet in October of 1932 at the Democratic State Convention in Albany. On stage, in front of a massive crowd of delegates, photographers, and reporters, Al approached FDR, extended his hand, and said, "Hello, Frank. I'm glad to see you." FDR replied, "Hello, Al. I'm glad to see you too, and that's from the heart." One reporter in the audience wrote that Al called FDR an old potato, a term of endearment from an Irish Catholic and a clear signal to Irish voters. Where the reporter got that story is unclear. Al had not called him an old potato, but the story caught on like wildfire. FDR's victory was all but assured, but in late October, 2 weeks before Election Day, FDR went in for the kill. In front of a crowd of over 10,000, FDR abandoned his previous caution and came out strong against prohibition. He called for the restoring of the legal production of beer and taxing it to help pull America out of the Depression. The crowd went wild, chanting, "We want beer," and pour it on. And if Al Smith had been there, he might have smiled. It might be argued that in the 1932 election, Americans didn't vote for FDR as much as they voted against Herbert Hoover. In the minds of many, Hoover was responsible for the Great Depression, and the bonus Army debacle had only added fuel to the fire. Hoover's lackluster, non-committal position on prohibition didn't do him any favors either. In the previous election in 1928, Hoover had won 41 states. In 1932, he won only 6, and all in the Northeast. FDR won in a landslide that cut across all regions of the country. He won over 22 million popular votes and 472 electoral votes. FDR, the candidate, had promised the American people a New Deal. During his first term, with Democratic majorities in both houses, FDR, the president, would largely deliver. In his first 100 days, he expanded government agencies and programs. Throughout his first term, he used the government, not big business, as a tool to pull America out of the Great Depression. FDR's New Deal earned him the love of the American people. The era of Republican dominance in American politics was over, and the era of Franklin Delano Roosevelt had arrived. This is episode 37 of American Elections Wicked Game, 1932, The Governors. On the next episode, the election of 1936. As FDR pushes his progressive agenda, Republicans turn to a progressive candidate of their own, Kansas Governor Al Landon. As Landon and the Republicans push to make the election a referendum on fiscal responsibility, FDR defends his New Deal against a slew of opponents, including his longtime rival and sometime friend, former Governor Al Smith. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Election's Wicked Game is an Airship production. Hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Sound designed by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Stephen Walters. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and CL Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.